So we're going to start off by building out our interface controls for our add TD method. I'm going to go into my HTML to begin with. And in the HTML, we're going to add a new button for adding to-dos. And we also want to add an input field so that the user can input the text that they want to add. And in order to keep things a little bit neater, I'm going to utilize some divs. So I'm going to cut my existing buttons and I'll make a div tag, and we'll just put those buttons inside of a div tag. And this is just so later on I can use some CSS and style these things and separate them out a little bit. Now we're going to create a new div, and this is going to create a button, and our button is going to have an onClick attribute. And we know that we want to make the value handlers because we're going to be creating a new property on our handlers object that is going to take care of adding the TD. So we'll just call this add TD. And the text that we want is going to say add. And then after we have that, we'll go ahead and have an input field. And I'm going to set the type to text. In addition, we'll add an ID. And we're going to need an ID so that we can grab this element and be able to manipulate it or gather information from it with our JavaScript. So I'm just going to call this add TD text input. This is important because without this, I would not be able to modify this input with the JavaScript. So that's all we really need to do inside of the HTML. I'm going to save that. If we look at this in the browser, this is what the page currently looks like. So we're going to have our buttons that we had previously, and now we have the add button and then the input field. And actually, let's go ahead and let's have the input field first and then the button. That makes a little bit more sense. So I'll just cut this button and I'll just put it inside of the div, but after the input field. So we'll save that. And once again, this is now what the page looks like. Now we'll go back into the JavaScript file, and I'm going to go down to the bottom where we have our handlers object, and we're going to add a new handler to handle the click on the add button. So I'll put a comma here, and I'm going to go ahead and set up my next property, which is going to be my add TD. And I'll use my colon, and we'll set this to a function. And then inside of the anonymous function, we're going to do a couple things here. This one needs to be set up a little bit differently in that we need to get the information that the user inputs into the input field. So let's create a variable, and I'm going to call this variable add TD text input. And I'm going to make that equal to my document.getElement by ID. And then I need to pass in the name of that input field, which is actually the same, right? We called it add TD text input. And after the closing parentheses, I'm going to use a semicolon. So this line of code is going to allow us to access the input element. And we do that by using the ID that we applied to that input field. So we're going to store this information inside of a variable, and our variable is going to be called add TD text input as well. Now that we have that, we're going to grab our add TD method and we're going to pass in the argument. So remember, when we used our add TD method, we were passing in the argument for the TD text. So we're going to have to incorporate that into what we're doing here. So I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to use my TD list dot add TD. And then in regards to the input, I want to grab what the user has actually typed into the input field. So we can get that information by using our name of our variable, add TD text input dot value. So remember that the add TD text input variable is now storing the input element that we called add TD text input. We're going to use the value property so we can get the value of that input field. And that's what we're going to pass in as our argument. And that should be it. We need to have our semicolon, and then this is the closing curly brace for my add TD function. So now we should be able to add items. Let's save this and let's go into the browser and test this out. So here we go. I'm going to add an item. So I'll just call this my item. And I'm going to click my add button. And you can see that it says my list of things to do, and here is our new item. So it actually has added this into the to-do list. So that part works great. There is a problem though. If we look back in the browser, the problem is that the input text field, the text that was entered, remains in the box. So it would make more sense if we deleted this, because once it gets added into the to-do list, we don't want the user to have to come over here and delete that and then add new text to add a second item. That information, to make this application more usable, should automatically disappear. So what we're going to do is we're going to go ahead and we're going to add an additional line of code so that we can clear this information. So back here inside of my JavaScript, I'm just going to come to the text that we already have, and underneath the line of code for the adding the to-do item and getting the value from the input field, we're just going to use add td text input dot value, and we're going to set that equal to, and we'll just put empty quotes. So that's just going to clear that input for the user. So if we save now and we come back to the browser and we refresh our page and we add an item, as soon as I click add, you can see that it deletes the information from the input field. So now I'm ready to add something else. And now it's added the second item and it's cleared the input field. And of course we can toggle all of these as being complete, and that's a toggle, so we could make them incomplete, and we can display the to-dos. So everything that we have so far is working. Our user is able to add a to-do item by inputting custom text and then clicking the add button. So this is much more user-friendly than using the console as we were doing before. We can't expect our users to go into the console so that they can use our application. We want to have a more GUI interface, and that's what we just created.